Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Multi-Agency Critical Incidents, or Herding Cats 101, brought to you by Commercial Electronics, an authorized reseller of higher ground public safety solutions. Let's wait just another minute or so while everyone gets logged on. Again, welcome, and thank you for joining us. This is the first in a series of sponsored webinars. Our goal is to provide a forum to share wisdom and experience between 911 communications professionals. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default, and all attendees are automatically muted to eliminate background noise. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select the handset in the audio pane at the bottom right, and dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit questions about today's lesson by typing your questions into the Q&A pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. I will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The best time to send in your questions is when you think of them. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and let us know how we did so we can continue to provide you with relevant content. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. For those wanting to report this training to their state certification or licensing agency, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. My name is Beth English, and I'm your instructor today. I began my 911 career as a police dispatcher 31 years ago, at the ripe old age of 9. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And most recently served as a communications director before joining Commercial Electronics as the program manager for their QI program and higher ground instructor. I have my master's telecommunicator license from Texas. I'm a TCOL instructor and a past president of Texas NENA. So let's get started with our session. Once upon a time, our agency had 2 armed robberies of individuals committed by the same suspects that occurred within minutes of each other. Almost immediately, it turned into a chase that went down the turnpike to a major highway and then into 2 other jurisdictions, both of which joined in the chase, along with state troopers and a helicopter unit. Now, the day before this incident, we had gone live with a new multi-agency radio system that included both of the other agencies involved in the chase. Before going live with the new radio system, all the agencies had gotten together and worked out a policy outlining how we would handle the radio traffic when we had a combined incident with all of us having access to each other's radio talk groups. The problem was, having not been involved in such an incident, we didn't know everything that could and would happen. Now, in our situation, the suspects wrecked out on the highway, then took off in foot. Okay, somebody's unmuted. Okay. Anyway, in our situation, they wrecked out on the highway, and then the suspects took off in different directions on foot. Because of all the agencies involved, it was determined that the talk groups needed to be patched together. So even though we had a common talk group that we could all communicate on, someone patched us on the main dispatch channels. We learned real quick that that wasn't going to work. Besides the fact that all the agencies were now on one talk group, each agency involved had a Unit 101 working that day, including the helicopter unit. So every time somebody called 911, or excuse me, every time someone called 101 on the radio, all of them answered. At one point, we even had 101 calling 101, and every 101 answered. So on the radio, we heard 101, go ahead. 101, you got traffic? Unit calling 101. 101 dispatch, did you call? It was a complete disaster. Somehow, though, through all of that confusion, the suspects were caught, and I'm still not sure how. So this is just one example of the things that can happen when you have a multi-agency response. So let's go over the lesson objectives for today's webinar. At the end of today's lesson, you will be able to identify different types of incidents considered critical. You'll be able to identify types of agencies that can and will respond to multi-agency critical incidents. You'll be able to list challenges encountered during a multi-agency critical incident. You'll be able to identify post-incident tasks to be completed after a critical incident. And you'll identify solutions for multi-agency critical incident challenges. Now, I'm going to go over a few of the things about multi-agency responses that I've learned the hard way, but before I do, let's do a quick survey. Have any of you had any personal experience with a multi-agency critical incident in your tenure on the job? You can answer yes, and everything worked perfectly as always. Yes, and we learned a lot of lessons the hard way. No, but my agency has in the past. Or, we don't have critical incidents, it's all sunshine and roses at my agency. So select the appropriate response and click Submit. Looks like so far, those of you that have answered say yes, and we learned a lot of lessons the hard way. Okay? Those of you who have not yet responded, go ahead and submit your responses, and we'll close the poll in a few moments. Okay, we're going to close the poll now, and it looks like most of you have said yes, we learned a lot of lessons the hard way, and some of you have said we don't have critical incidents, it's all sunshine and roses at my agency. Okay, I would like your agency name and address as soon as we're done. Okay, if you've had a multi-agency critical incident and you also learned some lessons the hard way, send them to me in the Q&A pane because I'd like to share as many of these as I can. So let's talk about what a critical incident is. A critical incident can be defined as any event that has a stressful impact sufficient enough to overwhelm the usually effective coping skills of an individual. Critical incidents are powerful events that fall outside the range of ordinary human experiences. They can be planned in advance, or they can be incidents that happen suddenly with no warning and typically involve multiple agencies, organizations, and resources. So what are some examples of sudden critical incidents? They can be natural events. For example, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and snowstorms, all of which are going on right now. Okay? They can be man-made, such as hazmat incidents, acts of terrorism, and police chases. One such hazmat incident happened years ago when an 18-wheeler carrying liquid chicken fat wrecked on a major highway in the Northeast, spilling the chicken fat all over the road. The highway was closed for several days while the state tried to clean it up with chemicals. But every time the sun came out and the road warmed up, the fat that had gone down into the cracks in the road melted and came back up, making the road slick again. It wasn't until Procter & Gamble sent a truck of Dawn to the scene that they were able to finally get it cleaned up permanently. Then afterwards, a spokesman for Procter & Gamble was asked if they were going to use the incident in any advertising, saying that they could advertise, "Get the fat out by the crack of dawn." That is one of my favorite hazmat stories. Other critical incidents might include missing children, holiday parades, or sworn funerals. So what agencies might respond to these different incidents? Well, of course, you're going to have your sworn personnel like police, fire, and search and rescue. Then you'll have service agencies such as the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and FEMA. You'll also have other organizations and departments such as CERT, Humane Society, Public Works, the Electric Company, and the Water Department. And last but not least, you'll have the volunteers, both civilian and sworn. So not only do these incidents create challenges for everyone on the scene, but the responses will also create challenges for PSAPs. So let's talk about some of those. First are the many challenges to communicating effectively during a critical incident. Radio interoperability has historically been the biggest challenge due to a lack of appropriate and efficient means to be able to timely transmit important information. In some communities, radio communication systems are incompatible within the various agencies or even departments in the same community. For example, the police department can't talk to Public Works, the fire department can't talk to animal control, or the highway patrol can't talk to local law enforcement. So Project 25 was initiated by public safety agencies and manufacturers to address this issue. Now, as radio systems have been upgraded in order to facilitate interoperability, you have multiple agencies that are able to communicate with each other and with the various communication centers involved. But with these agencies all using different PIN codes and signals to add a layer of privacy, this results in miscommunication and confusion when multiple agencies and disciplines respond to an incident. Think Code 58, 1097, and Signal 16. These codes and signals might have added a layer of privacy in the past, but it didn't take long for the listening public, and especially the criminals, to figure out what each one meant. So the confusion surrounding the codes during a multi-agency response resulted in a push to implement plain language, even having the verbiage added to the National Incident Management System, or NIMS guidelines. Since 9/11, most agencies have reverted from codes and signals to plain language. And with radio systems being encrypted now, there's really no need to try to be covert and secretive. Another radio issue to consider is the perfect storm. A lot, if not most, agencies are moving to P25 radio systems that have redundancy built into the redundancy. And so one of the promises of these new systems is that they will never go down. That is simply not true. You cannot rely on any system to remain 100% functioning, no matter how many promises are made or how many levels of redundancy are built in. So what will you do when your radio goes down completely? Do you have backup VHF, UHF radios? And do your employees know where they are? Are they built into your consoles now, or are they separate radios sitting in chargers? And most importantly, how often do your employees practice using them? One perfect storm I was involved in didn't involve the radios going down, but it brought out another resource that's not thought about in all areas of the country. 3 things happened at the same time that knocked out the electricity in the entire county. at 10 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve in 14-degree weather. The unexpected resource came from the Amateur Radio Club. Because of where we were located, we had a ham radio in communications and a couple of members of the club who had been background checked. So they were able to come into communications and help us with the traffic on that radio. And during the power outage, other club members drove around all night finding locations that had generators and electricity so we could direct the public where we needed to. This was especially important because we were too busy on 911 giving directions to citizens on how to cook their turkeys without electricity and how to keep their food from spoiling while their refrigerators weren't working. Did I mention it was 14 degrees? So if you've never thought about partnering with your local ham radio groups, you might consider bringing them to the table next time you work on your emergency operations plan, because they can be a huge resource to your agency. Now, with both of the incidents that I've mentioned, I learned several valuable lessons, although not all of the lessons I was going to learn. As I've been involved in different multi-agency response scenarios, I've had to modify policy with each one. Kind of like when you answer 911 and you think to yourself, now I've heard it all. Trust me, you haven't. There's always more to come. So before we go on to the next section, let's do another quick survey. Okay, do you work for a law enforcement agency that practices incident command on all calls? You can answer, no, I don't work for a law enforcement agency. Yes, but we don't practice incident command. Or yes, and we practice incident command on every call. So select the appropriate response and click submit. Okay, it looks like about 75% of you don't practice incident command, 12% of you don't work for a law enforcement agency, and 12% of you practice incident command on every call. Let me commend you, 12%. That's awesome. Okay. Another consideration with multi-agency responses is ICS or Incident Command System. Fire agencies use the Incident Command System automatically when responding to calls, whether it's a fire alarm or an industrial structure fire. And they do this to maintain their skills in Incident Command, because if you don't practice it on the small calls, then you won't remember how to use it on the big calls. However, very few law enforcement agencies practice incident command on a daily basis, and that can be problematic when a critical incident occurs. Part of the goal of incident command is to have those who are giving the directions in one place so that everyone in charge knows what is going on. If you have those in charge scattered between several different locations on different radio talk groups, then they aren't able to monitor what's going on at other areas of the scene. In one case I was involved with, we had one commander at the scene of a live ordnance that was found in a neighborhood. We had another commander on the highway shutting down traffic to the area, and we were calling the schools to put them on lockout. Once the ordnance had been safely detonated, the commander on the scene advised that traffic could be reopened on the highway. Now, the commander who was actually handling the highway situation was on a different talk group and didn't hear the transmission. He was eventually told by state troopers that he could let traffic resume. Then during the next command staff meeting, the two commanders wanted to know why the information was never relayed to the second commander about the highway being opened again. And they complained that he had to find out from another agency. Now, all the commanders had attended the NIMS training and were supposed to be familiar with the process. But because they didn't practice it, they didn't use it when they needed to, which resulted in confusion and unnecessary complications. Not to mention, they expected the radio operators to relay information from one talk group to another, all while dispatching other calls on the main channel, answering 911 calls from parents with kids in the nearby schools wanting to know what was going on, and performing EMD on another 911 call. Needless to say, that is not how ICS works. So if your agency, whether fire or law enforcement, doesn't practice ICS every day, now would be a good time to start before you have that critical incident or disaster. Another challenge to be considered, oddly enough, are the donations that come in during a critical incident. And it's not just a challenge for the responders. This includes communications also. Because often, citizens will gather items they no longer need, such as old, worn-out clothes, shoes, even underclothes, as well as other items that they deem essential. Then they start calling the communications center to ask where they can deliver the donations. Cities, counties, and agencies end up with hundreds, even thousands of items that are unusable and need to be discarded, which just becomes another task for those in charge of an incident to worry about, while at the same time trying to recover from the incident. Churches and other organizations will step up to help with the logistics of donations, but it can take time to determine who and where those receiving centers are going to be. In the meantime, your agency can be overwhelmed with that initial flood of donated items coming into your building. So it's best to anticipate that this will happen and have a process in place in advance of a critical incident. That way, you aren't scrambling to find someone who can be dedicated to handling the intake of the donations until such time as a process can be established with the various churches and organizations. One challenge that is often underestimated is the sheer number of volunteers who arrive to assist in search and rescue. Not only will you have sworn officers, firefighters, and public works personnel from other agencies responding, but citizens will rally to help each other and the responders in the best way they know how. If you haven't planned for this, it can add more chaos to what you already have because someone has to handle the volunteers, both sworn and civilian. A plan needs to be in place with specific personnel assigned to each group for when the volunteers start calling or showing up immediately after the incident, wanting to know where to respond. There need to be separate designated areas for police, fire, public works, and civilian volunteers to report, along with maps and other resources available for those who aren't familiar with the area. Basically, you want to make sure that they have the tools they need to do their jobs. Having this plan in place will save everyone from additional headaches and will keep volunteers from going into places they shouldn't be and possibly getting hurt. Now, keep in mind that depending on the type of incident, you may have these volunteers and extra personnel on hand for weeks or even months after the incident. As the weeks go on and sworn volunteers continue to report for duty, you want to make sure that you have a place for them to report that doesn't interfere with your communications center. If every time they report to your department, someone from communications has to let them into the locked areas of the building, this is putting an undue burden on the communications personnel. So make sure that the sworn volunteers have either temporary card keys or designated escorts to get into the areas they're expected to access. Now, in each critical incident that's been reported, one constant has been the looters. You've seen them on the news, raiding stores and other businesses, even as the waters are rising or the rioting is going on behind them. Critical incidents are considered a perfect time by the looters due to responders being overwhelmed with search and recovery, performing life-saving measures, and just general restoration to law and order. The looting becomes another issue to which they have to respond. In one critical incident our agency had, a bunch of citizens got together and formed a group that they called the Looter Booters in order to combat the looters. Their mission was to patrol all the damaged areas and to report any looters they came across. But then we also started receiving calls from them reporting members of their group being attacked or harassed, or even one looter started chasing members of the group. So we ended up having to appoint someone to be their point of contact to coordinate their patrol times and location, and also to school them on things to do and things not to do. Having a person assigned to handle any vigilantes would be a good idea, just in case. During a critical incident, when you're focusing on rescue and recovery, it's easy to forget about the animals. One thing to keep in mind is that you do not forget about the animals. During a critical incident, whether natural or man-made, animals will get displaced, and not all of them will be pets. Some of them will be wild animals, depending on your area. Some may be carried to other parts of the city by severe weather, such as a tornado or a hurricane, and others may just take off running, scared away from their homes by a storm or a loud noise. In these cases, you're going to have calls coming in from citizens who've lost their pets and calls from people who have found animals. And keep in mind, this doesn't normally happen in the middle of the day when the animal shelter is open. Normally, this is going to happen in late evening or middle of the night when animal control is off duty, veterinarian offices are closed, and you have no recourse for dealing with the animals. So this is something you can and should plan for in advance by including animal control, veterinarians, and animal rescue and rehab groups in your emergency operations plan. Have it detailed in your plan who will be called, by whom, and when they will be called. Having these contacts in place ahead of time will take a huge burden off your center when you have a critical incident, as well as solving something that can end up being a big problem for your agency. Although it seems like such a small thing to worry about in the wake of a disaster, more people are much more worried about their pets than their families. So it would be a good idea to make sure that you have provisions for this in advance. Now, let's talk about some post-incident tasks. Just because a critical incident has passed, it doesn't mean it's over. Recovery can last for months or even years after the actual incident. In the case of a natural disaster, cities and or counties will try to recover unbudgeted expenses incurred during the disaster and recovery from FEMA. In order to do this, certain procedures must be followed and the appropriate paperwork must be filed. Now, it's essential to have someone to coordinate that paperwork, checking to ensure that it's all completed correctly and submitted according to FEMA guidelines. The paperwork to be submitted will include documentation of all hours worked in relation to the incident by all employees, including those from other agencies, and all expenses incurred for purchases towards cleanup, reconstruction, etc. Now, this is an extremely important task because if the paperwork's not completed exactly as instructed by FEMA, you run the risk of having any reimbursement denied. And I can tell you from personal experience, the amount your city or county will pay for post-incident cleanup and reconstruction can run into the millions. And that may come from funds budgeted for raises or other employee benefits. These briefings will be done with all agencies involved, and most, if not all, will want copies of radio traffic during the incident, especially if the incident involved a shooting, a line of duty death, an act of terrorism, or some other man-made disaster. Copies of radio traffic and 911 calls need to be made as soon as possible in order to keep from losing any recordings due to retention periods. You'll also want to make sure you have a recording system that can handle the number of recordings a critical incident will generate. The incidents that I've mentioned previously have occurred during the last 31 years and involved 3 different agencies. In each of those agencies, I had the higher ground recording system, and I have personally been through a hurricane, a tornado, a flood, a snowstorm, power outage, and I've never lost a recording. Employee assistance programs should be utilized, especially if the incident involved the death or injury of a responder or communications officer. Often, the stress of an incident will adversely affect employees, even if no injuries were reported. In the event of a disaster such as a flood, a hurricane, a tornado, or a mudslide, for instance, the continued stress for days or weeks at a time will wear on employees to the point that they're no longer effective in their position. So it's imperative that the employer provides assistance to them in the aftermath. Some employees won't even know they need help until it's provided to them. Now, after any type of critical incident, you will need to do a quality assurance check. Many employees will get so overwhelmed with the incident, they'll throw caution to the wind and resort to saying what they actually want to say, which never ends well. So a certain amount of customer service skills can and will go out the window, but a critical incident does not give license to disregard all customer service training. So take the time to QA some calls to review with your team later. And remember, QA doesn't always have to be bad. You can find outstanding examples of service in the midst of a disaster, and you would definitely want to recognize those employees. So let's recap what solutions you can have in place to make those multi-agency critical incidents go as smoothly as possible. Have a radio plan in place. Know in advance what units will be on which talk groups. If talk groups must be patched, determine who will do the patching and when. Use agency names with numbers. If you have a backup plan in place, practice using it so when they need it, they know what to do. And consider partnering with your local amateur radio groups because they can be a huge resource to your agency. Now, you want to plan for the unplanned. So practice ICS on the small calls so you know what to do on the big calls. Be prepared to have someone available to handle the multitude of donations that start coming in immediately after the incident. It doesn't have to be someone from the agency. Plan for having vigilante citizens getting in the way and causing more mischief. Have a plan in place for dealing with them. Don't forget about the animals. Make arrangements with veterinarians, the animal shelter, and various rescue and rehab groups to respond as soon as possible after the incident to take care of the lost and found animals, both domestic and wild. And consider having one person designated to coordinate the FEMA paperwork to ensure it's done correctly for reimbursement. Remember, small mistakes in the paperwork can cause rejection of your reimbursement claim. Get copies of radio traffic and 911 calls as soon as possible before their retention period expires. And then take care of the caregivers. Utilize the agency's employee assistance program. Don't assume that everyone is fine after going through such a stressful time. Do quality assurance checks on calls and radio traffic. Recognize those who did outstanding work. And recognize everyone who helped during that time. Okay, I'm now going to begin answering the questions that have been submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Okay, so one question is, how would a law enforcement agency do ICS on calls? They would use ICS on calls that have 2 or more officers, the same way the fire department does. So the first unit on scene is command until or unless someone takes over command of the scene, such as a beat unit, a sergeant, or a more senior officer. In a large incident, such as a robbery with a perimeter set up, the incident commander would give the assignments to other officers as they join the call. Okay. Another question, why would you not patch your radios on the main dispatch channel? It would seem that would be the easiest way. Because that severely limited us. We needed to be able to hear the radio traffic from the chase, but we also needed to be able to dispatch other calls that were coming in. Not to mention, all the units from all the agencies were now on one talk group, as well as all the dispatchers. So after this incident, our solution was to have the agency that started the incident patch their main talk group to the shared talk group. And then once the situation became static, we moved all of them to an ops talk group and unpatched. Okay. That looks like all the questions we have. I hope this session was informative. It's important to us at Commercial Electronics that everyone have access to training, regardless of the size of their budget. Now, we'll be presenting a different public safety topic each month, and we'll be sending registration information as well as posting it on our website. So join us next month, Wednesday, July 10th at noon Central Time for our next session, From Punching Bag to Telecommunicator, Training Mistakes to Avoid When Developing Your Best Coworker. And then remember, if you need the information on today's lesson for CEUs, send an email to training@comelectronics.com. Okay, thank you for joining us. This presentation has been made possible by Commercial Electronics, provider of public safety solutions, including Higher Ground NG 911 recording, CQIP third-party quality assurance program, and Carbine 911 next generation call handling platform. Have a great day.